I'm going to talk to you about different stretch types right now. First, I'm going to go over active and passive stretching. And then I'm going to review static, dynamic, ballistic, and a little bit. I'll touch on PNF, but I'm in here alone, so there's not really going to be too much I'm going to be able to do about that. All right. So if you go back and watch my video on joint motions, joints, agonist and antagonist pairs, I think this is going to make a lot more sense to you than if you haven't watched it. An active, a passive stretch is one that I do that requires no effort from my agonist. So for example, this is a passive stretch of the hamstring. With hip flexion, my hip flexors are my agonists, and my hip extensors are my antagonists. So if my hip flexors are relaxed and I go to a stretch, this is a passive stretch because my hip flexors aren't doing any work to pull me into hip flexion. This would be considered, this would be considered an active stretch of the hamstring. I'm going into hip flexion by using my agonist, my hip flexors. I'm putting my antagonist, my hip extensors, on stretch. In this case, I'm putting my hamstring on stretch because my knee is extended. Okay, so this is an active stretch because my hip flexor is pulling me, it's working, it's contracting to pull me into that stretch. I'm going to give you an example of active and passive stretches at the shoulder now. I'm going to hold on to this PVC pipe, and I'm going to push my head through my shoulders to get more flexion. My shoulder flexors pull me into flexion. My shoulder extensors are put on stretch in this position. But my shoulder flexors aren't working. I'm using an external object to produce the force to create the stretch. Therefore, this is a passive stretch of the shoulder extensors. Really, this is a lat stretch. I can do the same thing with a PVC pipe using kind of PVC pipe pass-throughs. So here, I'm pulling my arms into, this is kind of a combination movement because it's not fully flexion. I'm not going to be able to give you full flexion. But I'm using my shoulder my shoulder flexors to pull the PVC pipe backwards to get a stretch in my lats, in my shoulder flexors. I'm also getting a little bit of pec stretch here because I've got some horizontal abduction in addition to some flexion. Horizontal abduction, flexion. If I'm here, I've got a combo of both. But this is going to get me a good stretch of the lat. And it's an active stretch because even though I'm using the PVC pipe, I'm engaged in my shoulder flexors to get a stretch in my shoulder extensors. All right, we're going to review static, dynamic, ballistic, and I'll attempt PNF for you here by myself of the hamstrings or the hip extensors. Okay, so a static stretch of the hip extensors would involve hip flexion, right? So the agonist, in order to stretch a muscle, I need it to be the antagonist in the motion. The hip extensors are the antagonists for hip flexion. So I'm going into hip flexion, and then to be static, I need it to just be still. There's no movement at all. I'm just going to hold it here, mild discomfort, for the ACSM parameters. Accumulate 60 seconds per joint in 2 to 4 reps. For a dynamic stretch is with movement. So static is still without movement. Dynamic is a with movement. I need to think about the motions that put my hip extensors on stretch. It's going to be the same motion, but I know that I need to be using movement. So here, a good exercise might be toy soldiers or Frankensteins, however you prefer to call them. ACSM says you do 5 to 12 reps. of increasing range. So here I'm using my agonists, my hip flexors, to pull myself into hip flexion to get the stretch on my antagonist, my hamstring. Okay? So that's a dynamic stretch, and I'll increase that over time. 5 to 12 reps, increase the range of motion as I get closer to 12 reps or however many I'm doing. A ballistic stretch is similar to a dynamic stretch because you want to achieve that end range of motion, but then you're going to bounce at that end range of motion. So here I start with my static position, right? So hip flexion, pull myself into hip flexion to get the stretch on my antagonist in my range of motion, and then I start to bounce. And this is ballistic stretching. You don't want to use this with a regular client. This is going to be reserved for your power athlete. To learn more about how to do PNF stretching, please refer to the videos I have posted for you to the module.